I'm going to read you the before and after version of a statement of purpose from a student who got into Stanford, Harvard, and UCLA for their Master's in Education or teacher credential programs. Not everyone can work with an advisor like me, so I'm going to read you the before version and the feedback and coaching that I gave this person to improve their essay. And hopefully a lot of that feedback will apply to you as well. If you don't want to see my feedback, you can jump to the timestamp to just read the after version. I stapled the last piece of felt on the pool table before my boss told me that it was time to go before the customers arrived. I started to pick up all of our equipment, but before I finished, the owner of the bar came up to me and asked me why I was working. I kindly responded, "I'm trying to make some money this summer to buy myself a laptop." He asked me how much money I needed, and I told him I was halfway there. After that, he gave me a $20 tip and told me, "No dejes de estudiar," don't stop studying. My parents told me that the only inheritance they would leave behind was my education. Growing up in South Los Angeles, it was easy to get flustered between balancing education, work, parents' immigrant status, and most importantly, the decision to go to college. To most, my educational experience is an anomaly. As a first-generation high school and college student, graduating from UCLA is an accomplishment that makes my parents, community back home, and myself proud. However, my educational success is attributed to the strong foundation I built in my later years of high school. Up until then, I was still unsure about my future. So I actually really like this intro paragraph. I think it's a great story that's very vivid, where they put us in a place. You know, this person is working physically on a pool table. It sounds like they're working at a bar, and they're working to buy themselves a laptop to go to college, where a lot of us don't really have to think about where a laptop comes from. So it's really interesting to get a sense of who this person is. And we also, hear that they speak Spanish. So, they don't tell us like, "Oh, I speak Spanish," or "I'm the child of an immigrant." They're not saying that exactly, but we get to know that through the way they tell the story, the way they talk about their parents' immigration status. So it's really great how this is done up here. There's a couple things, though, that I would encourage this person to do with more specificity. For example, this person says that their educational success is attributed to the strong foundation. But what is that strong foundation? Is that, study skills? Is that the community of people around you who've encouraged you? Is that, what does that include? So I asked this person to go into more details. They also say they're unsure about their future, but what were they unsure about? A little bit more detail there could really help this. Additionally, it's not yet clear what they're applying for and why. And I really think within the first, quarter of the first page, you should say, "I'm applying to get my master's in blah, blah, blah because blah, blah, blah." So it's upfront what you're applying for and why. So far, they haven't done that. Let's keep going. I started to have a different perspective during my junior year when my AP United States history teacher made me more critical. He managed to combine several topics into his course, and one day we went over opportunity costs with the hopes that it would encourage us to take his economics course the following year. He told us, "You have two options after graduation. You can work and earn a certain amount and stay stagnant for a couple years, or go to college, gain experiences, and have a better outcome and lifestyle." He was critical of our country's history and presented the subject in a way that impacted me and made me more interested in pursuing the subject further in college. There are countless scenarios that build up to this moment, but I felt that the experience in the classroom made me more interested in the subject, and I wanted to be as impactful in someone's life, such as a first-generation Latino history teacher. So in this paragraph, we see this person shift to talking about education and how their education impacted them, specifically one teacher that impacted them. However, what I want to help this person do is actually make more of a clear connection to why they want to be a teacher, since this is what they're applying for. So here, there are a couple things that are a little bit vague. And by getting more specific, we can start to connect the dots between the experience they had and what kind of educator they want to be. So we hear them say, they took this AP US history class and the teacher made them critical. Well, what does that mean? I'd love like a snapshot of, how you felt maybe before the class and how you felt after the class, and what happened in the classroom that shifted those perspectives. Additionally, when this person says down here, that the teacher presented the subject in a way that impacted them. Well, how did the teacher present the material and how were they impacted? And maybe what was different about this teacher compared to other classes that they've taken? What we're looking to see here is, why does a teacher and how they work matter? Because that is something that's probably going to influence this person and how they want to teach. Those kinds of specific details and connecting the dots is really what's going to take this SOP to the next level. Additionally, there's some details in here I would cut out. Like, for example, there's this sentence where they say he managed to combine several topics in the court. Like, that sentence doesn't need to be there. It could just be deleted. You don't need it to move forward the story that the person is trying to tell. And then down here, as I mentioned earlier, down here at the end of this paragraph would be a great opportunity to mention like a connection back to, I want to be a teacher who can have this kind of impact on people, which is why I'm applying to Stanford's master's program. That's what we want to see early in the statement of purpose, what you're applying for and why. And I think this is a really great setup to get there, but we want to make sure we state very clearly upfront, I'm applying to this program because blah, 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 blah. I struggled between two fields of study in college. I wanted to be an immigration attorney because I felt that law was the answer to many problems facing my community. But as my real-world experience accelerated, I found myself having a more rewarding experience by directly working with students. I want to pause right here because this is something I see a lot, which is a really long sentence. I always say this as a rule. If you have a sentence that is spilling onto a fourth line, it needs to be edited down. Most of the time, you can split it into two sentences or eliminate some of the words. But you want your writing to actually have more short sentences because that makes it easier on the reader. Remember, admissions committee reviewers are reading dozens, if not hundreds, of essays very quickly. So you really have to make it easy on the eyes. I was a legal assistant for an immigration clinic and had several cases where young children were facing fears of deportation. I worked alongside an attorney to develop a strategy that would hopefully grant the child immediate relief from deportation. Most of the children I worked with were under the age of 16. They had to sit with me in a room for several hours answering questions about the reasons they migrated and why they wanted to live in the United States. There came points in the interviews where I felt distant and detached from the child because I was more concerned about the details of the case than their emotions. I had to draw a fine line between being professional and showing empathy with the children. 2 hours was not enough for me to learn more about their interests, what they enjoyed doing on the weekend, and how they pictured their life, and if everything was calm instead of chaotic. Even though I tried to bridge a connection with the children, I only saw them about once a month. So in this paragraph, we're starting to see this person shift from, what they thought they wanted to do to now why they're moving into education. However, I want to see them connect the dots a little bit more clearly. For example, they're saying that, when they were working with children in this way, it was very limited. But what I want to see them do is take this a step further and say, I realize I want to spend more time directly with children who are in these circumstances so that I can have a bigger impact on them rather than these momentary interactions with them as a lawyer. So we want them to connect the dots a little bit more tighter to why they want to go into education and how they want to approach education. However, this was not the case back in my community. I spent much of my undergraduate career volunteering at my local church on weekends with programs that were meant to promote student learning, engagement, and sustainability. These church activities allowed me to build a sense of credibility, and when the time was right, it allowed me to assist students with similar backgrounds with their college applications. I spent 3 summers working at a nonprofit organization in Blank College. The program brought international students together, but also helped by providing full financial aid to students throughout the United States. The program made a strong emphasis on diversity. There, I was able to teach 2 courses. The first course was a public speaking class, and the second was a criminal investigation course. I developed a class curriculum and set objectives every single day. I was monitored by a curriculum advisor, and I strived to make the class engaging and informative every day. My favorite moment was one of the classes I taught where we spoke about the social problems behind the criminal justice system. We addressed the criminalization of the most vulnerable populations in the United States and small step solutions that we could take to prevent recurring themes from occurring. I could have easily just taken them to a police station that day, but I wanted the students to learn beyond ideas and concepts they are familiar with and help garner the tools necessary to be critical and engaging in everyday topics. In this paragraph, we see the students start to tie in elements of their abilities and skills that relate to teaching. It's really important that we highlight those abilities, and it's awesome that they have a lot of experiences to draw on. However, we want to make sure that the details they're providing really demonstrate, here's how they approach education, here are the skill sets that they have. We see this first example of volunteering at their church and helping people with their college applications. However, there's not enough detail in here for us to get a sense of who this person is and how they approach education. So they just mentioned briefly, I did these activities. Well, what activities? And then they said they built a sense of credibility. What does credibility actually mean? Why is that important in education? How did you build credibility? Maybe it's more like they had to earn the trust of the youth that they were working with. Well, what was that like? How did you earn their trust? How did you connect with them? Was this person able to connect with them because they have a similar background? And they say similar background, but they should name what that background is, like other students who were children of immigrants, or maybe from the Latinx community, whatever it is. We want to see that fleshed out a little bit more. And maybe this is its own paragraph. And then they have this second example working at the nonprofit and teaching about criminal justice. And I think this is great because it's actual teaching experience. However, it's a little bit confusing and a little bit vague the way they describe their experience. We see that they were teaching about the criminal justice system, but the way they describe their experience isn't telling me how they approach education. So it says, we spoke about the social problems behind criminal justice. We addressed the criminalization of the most vulnerable populations and small step solutions that we could take. Well, what does that mean? Like, how did you present that information? Were you using media? Were you using a combination of text and reading? What was the methods of educating that you were using? That's what we want to see to get a sense of how this person is as an educator. And so we want to see more details. I like to think of this as the who, what, where, when, how. So, step one, we did this, and then we did this, and then the students learned this, and here's how I helped them learn that. We want to see those kinds of details to get a sense of their skill sets. And again, we want to have them bringing this back to why they want to be a teacher, how they'll be as a teacher. I would like to believe that my narrative growing up is uncommon, but even in the realm of higher education, I find a recurring theme. This past summer, I was a new student advisor for incoming freshmen, and whenever I had a student from cities around my hometown, I was a little more excited to meet them. However, many of the students that were from my hometown were just like me and were oftentimes not prepared to tackle the complexity of college. This unfortunate cycle made me feel sad and pushed me to work harder. I will never forget two students I had from South Los Angeles. They were both really good friends and happened to be in the same group. They were quiet and reserved, but as soon as I told the students that I was from Southgate, California, they opened up. They started to ask me questions about college and asked me to talk to them about my experience. One of the students wrote down 23 questions they had about college and said they had never felt comfortable sharing their worries about college until they had met someone who would understand. Being a brown Latino male from South Los Angeles gives me a unique and powerful lens that can help students resonate and feel comfortable as I did with my history teacher. So I think this is a really great point that the student is trying to make, that their unique background and experience is something that allows them to connect with students who often don't have role models from those same backgrounds. So I think this is a great point that they're trying to make in this paragraph. I might shorten this a little bit. So this section I highlighted here is maybe a little bit TMI, and we see them come back around to that point later down here. And so I might just delete this part and let this point stand in the second part when they talk about the student feeling comfortable sharing their worries with this person. But overall, I think this is a really great point that they're trying to make. So if you have personal experience with the topic you're going into work with, I think this is a point you can make in an essay that you're writing for yourself. I also really like how they bring this back to their connection with the history teacher that they had. I believe that Stanford's program will help me develop and hone the skills I've gained during my undergraduate career. I'm strongly passionate about higher education in low-income and minority community, and the program's emphasis on urban education makes me feel that it would be a perfect fit. I would love the opportunity to take courses with Stanford faculty and talk to them about the challenges that students from my areas face and what could be done to help. The most logical and effective answer that I know I can be a part of is being a teacher and serving in the community that allowed me to become the young and determined man who writes this essay. In this paragraph, I want to see them get a lot more specific about the program and how the program aligns with their goals. So when they talk about the skills they have gained and the skills they want to gain, actually list those out. I have skills in X, Y, and Z, but I need to develop further skills in X, Y, and Z. Or when they mention that the program's emphasis on urban education is a perfect fit, well, what makes it a perfect fit? What are they covering? What's the curriculum covering? Who's teaching in those topics? Do they have us focus on working with Latinx communities? Get into the specifics about what the program offers. You can name courses you want to take, professors you want to work on, research that's happening at the university that you want to get involved in. All those different things are ways to get more specific about the university. And finally, I think this last sentence is a little convoluted and not well written, and there's some grammatical errors, but I think the point they're trying to make about being a teacher who serves their community to help inspire others to earn their education and have opportunities, I think that's a great point. We just want to word that in a way that is more clear and more powerful as a way to end. Now I'm going to show you the improvements this person made to their statement of purpose with the final version that got them into Stanford. I was finishing cleaning up the pool table area when my boss called me over. It was time to go, he said, before the customers started to arrive. I was 14 years old at the time and wasn't allowed in the bar when alcohol was being served. As I went to leave, the owner of the bar approached me and asked me why I was working during the summer. I responded, I'm trying to earn enough money this summer to buy myself a laptop for school. He asked me how much money I needed and I told him I was halfway there. He gave me a $20 tip and told me in Spanish, Nunca dejes de estudiar. Never stop studying. So I noticed in this version, the person added a few more details. Like they mentioned they're 14 and working in a bar during the summer. It's not very common for 14-year-olds to be working that kind of job. So that little detail tells us this is someone who's a really hard worker. This is someone who's really committed. My parents always told me that the only inheritance they would leave behind for me was my education. They treasured it because they themselves only reached the 10th grade in their home country of El Salvador. Growing up in Southeast Los Angeles, I learned to balance my education, work, my parents' immigration status, and most importantly, the always looming decision of where to go to college. My educational experience has been unusual, bridging the two worlds in which I was raised. In one world, I'm the son of two immigrant parents from an impoverished small town in El Salvador, parents who fled a 12-year civil war and came to the U.S. despite the ever-present threat of deportation. In another world, I'm a first-generation high school student and college student graduating from UCLA to make my parents, community, and myself proud. My educational career began in a school system that valued obedience and order over academic achievement. In my first year of high school, I was in a classroom where students received disciplinary action for talking too loudly or not paying attention. The idea was that punishment would help the students understand their mistakes, but that was rarely the case. Students' family composition, immigration status, and socioeconomic status were not properly taken into account. Many of my Latinx friends only spoke Spanish and were often marginalized and belittled for their inability to speak English. I found myself translating and guiding them through the limited resources our school offered. When time came for them to apply to college, they were only granted minimal fee waivers because they were reserved for more eligible students. This is a much improved version from the first draft we saw. Here, there are a lot more details that actually show us what this person's life experience is like and what education was like for them. In the first version, they briefly mentioned something about their parents' immigration status. Here, we see a lot more details about who they are and what their educational experience was like. This is really great because in that first version, they said, I had this teacher and they helped me become more critical. But we didn't know what they were like before and what they were like after. So here, they're really setting up, this is what education was really like for me. You know, I'm in an environment where a lot of people don't speak English and the focus is on obedience rather than on learning. So we're getting a sense of how they see education, what is their unique point of view of education. Our school's curriculum was outdated and failed to critically analyze the history of the students fleeing persecution, poverty, and even death threats. When a student was struggling or did not complete an assignment, teachers often penalized them instead of trying to understand why. It was not until I arrived at UCLA that I learned about these historical forms of oppression against my Latinx community. I learned that my success in high school and where I stand today were at the expense of other students who were not deemed smart or dedicated enough during their early years. During my undergraduate career, I debated between two fields of study, immigration law and teaching. I wanted to be an immigration attorney because I wanted to represent immigration communities and the challenges of deportation my family faced growing up. So we see in this version, they cut out that story about the teacher who influenced them that I mentioned was really vague. And now they're getting into a lot more details about their experience of education. And I think it's a lot more powerful. The first version was almost too safe. And this one, it's like they're really putting forward their point of view, what life was like for them. And they're not sugarcoating things. Like some of these things are hard to hear if you're someone who's worked in education and have maybe seen some of these negative externalities that were probably not intentional. But this person is calling out the system in a way that shows this is what I care about and this is what I stand for when I approach education. Last year, I became a legal assistant for an immigration clinic in Los Angeles. I worked alongside a team of immigration attorneys to represent unaccompanied children facing deportation. I interviewed and recorded their responses as supporting documents so that they could be granted temporary protection from deportation. Most of the children I worked with were under the age of 16. When I interviewed them, the last question I always asked was why they migrated to the United States. Without hesitation, nearly all of them responded that they wanted to go to school and establish a career to help support their families back home. Unfortunately, many of them were alone or staying with distant relatives who were also in vulnerable conditions and could offer little support to help them shape their dreams and objectives. The unjust and demoralizing laws have made the most vulnerable and marginalized communities targets of systemic discrimination. We see in this version, the person is a lot more specific in what they did. The first version, they talk about this, but they don't get into the details of saying, I was recording interviews. Here's what I was asking them. Here's what I learned. Here's what I discovered. Here's why this matters, or here's what was unveiled to me while working on this. So we see in this version, those kinds of specifics really make this a lot more powerful than the first version we read. Although I gained valuable experience working in law, over time I found it much more rewarding working directly with students. I spent a significant portion of my undergraduate career volunteering at my local church on weekends. The dichotomy between UCLA and my community made me realize that many of my peers from home were not being sufficiently prepared for higher education. On weekends, I developed programs to promote student learning, engagement, and most importantly, provide young individuals with the opportunity to be in a space with role models. Many of the students were low-income, first-generation, and from households that were either undocumented or of mixed status. I was able to connect with these students because we shared a similar language and experiences with immigrant parents. That connection made it easier for them to open up to me and for me to assist them with their college applications and homework assignments. So we see in this version, the person separated this into a new paragraph and it went into more detail. Like I mentioned in the first version, I was like, what do you mean by we come from similar backgrounds? Here they go into more detail on what those similarities were and why them having those similarities was important for them to help make connections and be a role model in that community. I wanted to expand my work further and gain actual teaching experience, which led me to spend 3 summers with a nonprofit organization at Blank College. The program brought international and domestic students together by providing full scholarships to students with financial need, emphasizing the importance of diversity. The space was unique because it merged students from high and low socioeconomic backgrounds. Out of the 150 staff members, I was the only Latinx male instructor. I was able to teach 2 elective courses, public speaking and criminal investigations. I developed a class curriculum and set objectives every day. A curriculum advisor monitored my progress, and I strived to make the class engaging, informative, but also meaningful. It was the first time I had to gauge student learning, their abilities, and to understand different backgrounds and create a collaborative educational community. I focused on students' ability to understand and master the skills we were learning, but placed special attention on the students who struggled in the class. I found that the students that struggled the most were those who shared similar experiences with me. In the first version of this essay, this person was struggling to describe what they were trying to teach in criminal justice, but in this version, they're not focused on what they were teaching in the classroom, but the skills they gain in teaching, in having an advisor, developing a curriculum, gauging student learning. So they're more focused on the skills than describing what exactly they taught. And that actually makes this paragraph a lot more clear and easy to understand. I also think this is a really powerful sentence that out of 150 staff members, they were the only Latinx male instructor. And that really shows that this person is unique. They are putting themselves in an environment that a lot of people like them are not in. If in your application, you've had experiences where you are the only one like you in something, like maybe you are one of the only females in your engineering program or something like that, it's really great to call that out, how you're someone who's kind of going against the grain. They came from immigrant and hardworking parents. I noticed that they lacked student agency and felt intimidated by the life experiences of some students who had traveled to 20 countries or whose parents were attorneys and doctors. I resonated with their feelings and had to strike a balance in the learning curve of life found in the classroom. The students' final project was to develop a TED Talk and speak about anything they wanted to share with the class. I spent time with students individually, but made sure to especially help those students who felt that they had nothing to share. For some students, this was their first time talking in front of an audience. However, being able to sit next to a student and understand where they are coming from in a space that is intimidating allowed me to build student trust and explore areas they otherwise may not have reached without additional help. At the end, all of the students presented their talks in front of their peers from other classrooms and were able to value their own experiences regardless of their background. In this paragraph, we really get a sense of this person's personality and how they approach teaching. They really approach it by building trust with students, paying attention to them, by valuing them and their backgrounds. And that's something that is really valuable in the world of education. So we get a sense of who they are. And this comes across really strong in this paragraph. And in the last version of the essay, they said something like, I built credibility with the students, but they didn't tell us how they did that. In this paragraph, we come to the conclusion that they built trust and credibility with students without them having to say, I built credibility, I built trust. They're demonstrating by example how they connect with students. As a product of an inner city schooling system, I am aware of the effects that poor education can have on young people. Stanford's education program will help me further develop and hone the teaching and curriculum development skills I have gained through my summer teaching experiences. I plan on building on these skills in order to give back to my community by connecting with students more profoundly and showing them the tools they need to access higher education. Having a balanced student-to-teacher ratio and access to faculty such as Ramon Martinez, who focus on Latino education, will help me garner the tools I need to critically participate in the educational field and make a difference in my own community. So in this version, we see more specifics with naming the faculty that they want to work with and talking about the skills they want to gain while they're in graduate school. My parents told me growing up that education is the only inheritance I have, and I want other students who come from similar backgrounds to have the same opportunity. My experience and presence in education can diversify that representation and allow me to critically participate in the conversation of how we can further help students who come from backgrounds that are low income, first generation, non-native, yet with the passion and desire to learn. This is a very simple conclusion that we see brings together a theme and a thread that's been throughout this entire essay, which is this idea of this person being someone who understands the community they come from and wants to serve that same community, and how they will make a difference in education by being someone who has the background they have. So I think this is a really great way to tie together this whole essay. If you want to get help like this from me on your essays, you can check out my free monthly office hours, my upcoming workshops, and my essay review services. Learn more in the links below in the description.